say it. Something to say, then say it.
Streets are empty, time standing still. You wait for the bus to come by, but it never will. These streets are empty, time standing still. You wait for the bus to come by, but it never will. Walking home to nothing like the queen without her crown. I must be the only one who wants to leave this town. Streets are empty.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Did you enjoy your evening in Ottawa last night? Yes? Good. For those of you joining us online, welcome to Ottawa, Canada, and to the Open Government Partnership Global Summit 2019. Pour ceux qui se joignent à nous directement en ligne aujourd'hui, on vous souhaite la bienvenue de la ville d'Ottawa au Canada au sommet mondial 2019 du partenariat pour un gouvernement ouvert. So, quite a day we've got for you today, and we're kicking it off with a fantastic plenary session. Notre plénière aujourd'hui adressera l'impact du PGO dans le contexte des changements géopolitiques des démocraties. Today's plenary session will discuss OGP and its impact in the context of shifting geopolitics of democracies. So to moderate our impact today, pour animer notre plénière aujourd'hui sur l'impact, veuillez accueillir le vice-président senior des études, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Senior Vice President for Studies, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Mr. Thomas Carruthers. Let's welcome him.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. The purpose of this session is to examine the future of the open government movement and of the open government partnership. And we're going to do so by taking a close and careful look at the current international political landscape. I hardly need say to this group that the international political landscape is troubling. We're at a minimum in an age of democratic stagnation, and by some people's account, a time of democratic recession. Now, I'm not going to detail here all the many elements of that picture because it's familiar to many of you, and there have been so many discussions both in print and in person in the last couple of years about the woes of democracy that I don't really want to start us off with a cold shower in that way. But we'll come to some of those issues. But this context does force the open government movement, I think everybody in this room and everybody who cares about these issues, to ask a number of hard questions about where we are and how we move forward in this context. For example, what is the relationship between these larger political currents in the world that are pulling democracy in some troubling ways and the open government agenda? Is it a simple relationship of correlation, or are there complex relations between elements of the larger political picture and the open government agenda? Another question is it time to rethink some of the foundational assumptions on which this field was built? Like many areas of sort of international value-oriented activity in recent years, we have to reconsider what this context says about basic assumptions we made. For example, this is an area, I would say, strongly marked by an ethos of all good things go together. There's been a general feeling that there's a virtuous cycle that needs to be created in which open government delivers more for democracy. It helps deliver socioeconomic goods. Those in turn reinforce the capacities and the values of democracy and good socioeconomic performance, and that all this will go together hand in hand. But instead of an age in which all good things go together, it can sometimes feel that we're living in an age when all bad things are going together and virtuous cycles are not being created in what we thought was a very persuasive agenda in which open government would be positive both politically and economically is not being as persuasive to some people as we thought or hoped. So that's certainly a second question has to be on our mind. And then a third question is, given this context, how can the open government movement do things differently, do more, in order to respond to this context and be a positive actor helping to move things forward? Now, I mentioned a troubling context, but I think it's also important not to lapse into a simplistic view that democracy is simply on the ropes, moving backward. That's not actually what's happening in the world. There are a lot of complexities. For example, we talk a lot about closing civic space, and indeed, there are many governments taking terrible actions related to civic space. Yet at the same time, there's been an eruption of large-scale civic protest movements in many different countries to significant consequence in many places. And how do we square this picture of closing civic space with the reality of the eruption of protests in so many places? So that's one complexity. Another complexity is it can seem that corrupt actors are acting with impunity, particularly corrupt authoritarian actors are acting with impunity across borders to do what they want. Yet at the same time, anti-corruption action, both protests and advocacy, has been taking down quite a few leaders in the world in the last 5 years. A little study I did last year showed that 10% of the world's leaders had been driven out of power in the last 5 years by anti-corruption activity. Well, that's pretty sobering if you're a corrupt leader. So that's a third complexity, a second complexity. A third is it can certainly feel like there's a lack of international leadership on many of these issues, as certain states, particularly the United States, have turned away in some ways from some of these values, and other states are distracted by internal political developments. So we can feel that this is a field lacking some of the leadership that we thought we had before. Yet at the same time, we see other states stepping up with activities. The UK government and Canadian government, for example, working together on a big media freedom summit coming up this summer. This summit and the Canadian government's activities to stake itself on these issues, and a number of other actors as well. And so we do see kinds of leadership at the same time that we can lament a larger picture in which leadership seems troubled. So these are just some examples of complexities, and I want the spirit of this discussion here to highlight the kind of intricacies and complexities of the issue rather than simply to either adapt a simplistic narrative of democratic gloom or a superficial narrative of this is all going to pass, we're going to be fine. Now we're going to be informed in this discussion, and we'll be talking about the OGP's new flagship report, Democracy Beyond the Ballot Box. This report represents a very important advance for OGP, both analytically, demonstrating its research capacity that's been building, but also bringing the democracy subject in the OGP agenda closely together, and also presenting an analytic framework, an assessment framework that can be used by members and begin to help the OGP become an organization that doesn't just recommend, but begins to define standards in more precise ways and assess. So this report is really significant. We're going to hear about it. And this report has been made possible by support OGP has received from the International Development Research Center, by the UK's Department for International Development, and also, of course, by the dues-paying members of the OGP. And I know OGP is grateful to all of those actors for this support. So we have a great panel here to discuss these issues. They're a long way away from me, but I see them here. And we'll bring them in the following order. We're first going to hear from Lucan Wei. Lucan is professor of political science at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, and has been one of the leading writers in the last 10 years on authoritarianism. The book he did with Stephen Levitsky on competitive authoritarianism was a landmark book in the field. He also has a book, Pluralism by Default, which I recommend to you, about authoritarian practices in different places. So Lucan is a thoughtful analyst of the broad, I say, political scene. After him, Joseph Foti, who's the Chief Research Officer at the Open Government Partnership and has a long record of really very practical but analytically rigorous research assessing open government issues. And he, before that, was with the Access Initiative that the World Resource Institute coordinated. And so he has a long record of experience and research in this area. And then Sandra Papera. Sandra is Director for Gender, Women, and Democracy at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs in Washington, where Sandra leads a lot of really interesting and very foundational work on gender and politics. And she brings to that work a long record of experience in development work. She worked for a number of years at UK DFID and other engagements as well, like teaching at the University of Ghana. And so Sandra will help bring some additional perspectives to the discussion. Then we have Douglas Rutson, who's the president and CEO of the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. I'm sure known to many of you, both the organization and Doug, who has led this organization to be a premier actor working on legal frameworks for civic space, but well beyond just the narrow legal issues into a lot of really important advocacy work relating to civic space and related issues. And last by no means least, Sunita Kaimon, who is the Chief Operating Officer of the Natural Resources Governance Institute, where she's responsible for all the things a COO does in such an institute. And in addition, she was the Civil Society Chair in the OGP for a number of years, so has a close engagement with OGP and brings some useful perspectives on that. So terrific panel, and I'm going to go in this order. I'm going to ask each panelist a question or two, and then engage them in a discussion as we move along. Let me start with Lucan. Lucan, you've been a thoughtful analyst of the state of authoritarianism in the world is you've seen all of the accounts in recent years that authoritarianism is winning, democracy is losing. Is that how you see the world? And if we try to bring in the open government perspective into that, are open government issues really directly opposed to authoritarianism, or do we have to worry that authoritarians sometimes co-opt open government practices or norms or rhetoric for their own use? So tell us a bit about the changing picture of authoritarianism to help sort of set the scene.
Great. Thank you so much. If I could have the slide. There it is. Yeah, so this is obviously a period of enormous pessimism. It's almost taken as a given that democracy is in decline and that authoritarianism is triumphant. This is the number of democracies in the world since 1988 until 2018. Does anybody see a recession? I don't. So I mean, I think what's interesting is that according to VDEM, which is the most comprehensive analysis and thorough analysis of the state of democracy, in their latest report, they state that there are more democracies in the world now than at any point in history. So it's just worth keeping this in mind when we're talking about decline. So the question I want to ask first is sort of how do we explain this contrast between the sort of kind of the general sort of feelings of democratic decline with the fact that sort of, at least in terms of the raw numbers of democracies, there really is relatively little evidence of decline. I mean, I think, the first is that sort of it's important not to confuse threats to democracy, such as, very real threats, such as the sort of rise of authoritarian powers of China, the rise of populist leaders, and the like, sort of rise of racism, with actual democratic decline. And in fact, it might be, if we look back 20 years from now, that this will be seen as a period not of democratic decline, but of democratic resilience in the face of profound and very real challenges. At the same time, I think there are real reasons for concern, obviously. The first is that a lot of the reason for concern is that, which countries have declined. In other words, it's now, what we have seen in the last 5 years is countries that previously were thought to be consolidated, such as Hungary and Poland, United States, are facing real problems. And this is, in this sense, I mean, what this graph represents is a sort of net gain, net loss. So, some of the gains have been in countries that are much poorer and less stable, whereas the declines have been in countries that are previously thought quite durable. Furthermore, the declines have also been in quite big countries. In other words, this is just, treats each country as its own unit, but some of the countries that have declined are places like India. So in terms of population, VDEM suggests that about a third of the world's population is suffering some kind of democratic decline. Furthermore, the decline has been in areas that are sort of, in some ways, far less severe, but also very important in areas of openness and the civic space, which are really the focus of OGP's activities, and really this really makes sense as this is really the front line. To the extent that there is sort of democratic decline, it's really in these areas. So autocrats today, in Hungary and the like, very often sort of allow for relatively clean elections, do not ban opposition, but instead work around the edges basically to systematically deprive opposition of access to the large audience media, to the rule of law. And this is really the area of most concern. So it's really wonderful that OGP is working in this area. Here we see, you can see the blue and yellow are sort of, declines in the average access to freedom of expression and freedom of association, and there's sort of a slight increase in sort of electoral competitiveness over time. Again, you sort of have to, you really a little bit have to sort of squint to see the actual evidence of decline, but it is definitely there. But I think one of the sort of lessons from looking at, broadly the global lessons of what's been going on in the last 10 years, is that some of the threats are very hard to combat because they're much more complicated, hard to identify, and much less likely to elicit sort of an international reaction. So in Hungary, for example, which has which is no longer, I think, a democracy, it's done so not by killing journalists or by or jailing opposition leaders, but by using the state, the state mechanisms to buy off opposition media and basically deprive opposition of any access to large audience media. So these are effectively very serious violations of democracy, but they're done in such a way that are very hard for most people, even experts, to sort of identify, which makes them much harder to mobilize around. So in this sense, I mean, I think that OGP's activity is really, extremely important.
Just one quick follow-up question. You're describing a kind of authoritarianism by asphyxiation, if you will. And yet, I mean, a different account would have it that, I'm curious what you think about this, Luke, and that it isn't that democracy is on the ropes and democracies are feeling insecure. A different way of looking at it, but you say, given the activation of citizens in the world and the general anger of citizens towards political elites of all types, all power holders, authoritarian, semi-authoritarian, democratic, are feeling pressures and are feeling insecure. So a different way of looking at the current context is that organized political power is really under challenge of all types, rather than an age of democratic recession. Is that a legitimate alternative narrative in your view?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways you can see that's true. I mean, I think in some ways some of the populist challenges are by sort of, parts of the population which were previously not part of the political establishment. So in that way, even the sort of what you have also in this era, which in some ways it's both in the sense that a lot of this popular activism and mobilization is not in favor of democracy, but actually opposed to it. So Graham Robertson has recently written a book on Putin and sort of argues that sort of a lot of the, that there is a sort of, we should not assume that autocrats do not rely on popular support. I mean, that, in fact, that is, much of the movement behind contemporary authoritarianism. I mean, Viktor Orban in Hungary, the Chavistas in Venezuela, not Maduro, but the Chavistas have, all of these actors have significant popular support. And so simply sort of the activation of the masses is not necessarily the same thing as the promotion of democracy.
All right, we'll probably come back to this. Joe Foti, tell us about democracy beyond the ballot box. And we don't mean to hit the audience with too many PowerPoint slides and data first thing, but we do want to get a lot of information out on the table. So Joe, give us a little bit of an overview of some of the findings of the report.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Well, so this report comes 8 years into OGP being around, and we have done a little bit of analysis over time, but we've never summarized it all in one place. So let me back up. We've talked about the global context a little bit, and this also comes, same data Luke is showing you, presented slightly different way. We've seen improvements in elections, number of officials elected in more countries than not over these years. And we've seen freedom of expression, rule of law, freedom of association declining. So that's the global context. The question we have to go to is, what is happening within OGP countries and what can we do about it? And have we done anything about it? And that's what this report sets out to analyze. Really ask questions of alignment. Again, this is a session on impacts. So the question is, what have we actually tried to impact is the first question. And the second is, what are the results? We zoom into OGP countries, and actually it's rather troubling. This is Economist Intelligence Unit data, different data set, but this has declined over the last 10 years within OGP countries. The orange, unfortunately, has declined. Not all of these are significant, but it's the overwhelming majority, which is troubling. But let's zoom into the policy level and look at where OGP countries have made progress and not. And some people don't like this graph, but I'm going to explain it to you. The farther right you go on this graph, the more OGP countries have had ambitious, complete, or impactful commitments according to the independent reporting mechanism. So on the right, you can see that the majority of OGP countries, according to the independent reporting mechanism, have had impactful commitments in budget transparency, open contracting, right to information, and a few in open rules and regulations. What's interesting here on the left is the large amount of untapped potential. And in red, you can see some of the civic space areas. Again, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, free expression, and protection, human rights protection. Interestingly, you also see some open data when you look at specific data sets, hasn't made as much progress as you had. Other areas like beneficial ownership and budget participation are new areas, and so we expect them to move to the right over time, hopefully. But this is essentially, when we're talking about impacts, because OGP countries haven't made as many efforts in these areas, we wouldn't expect to see as many impacts. So that is one of the challenges laid out by this report. The report really doesn't stop there at the analytical level there. It tries to actually give the tools to OGP countries and actors working in OGP member localities to deal with that. So in order to do that, we wanted to highlight, for example, the different policy areas that each country is working in and what it's achieved. So OGP is great in that it deals with national flavor, and this country is dealing with a state water cadastre, for example, that might not be popular among everyone, but it's worth looking at. But what we really wanted to zoom in on, and again, let me explain this, and you can pick up copies outside of all OGP members. We wanted to look at what have countries or members, achieved. Do they have commitments in these areas? And here we've looked at civic space. There are 12 different areas that we look at in the report. What are they doing about association, defending journalists and activists? What are they doing about assembly? And what has the IRM said about it, about that work that they've done in it? Is it ambitious? Is it complete? Is there any evidence that it changed the way that governments do business? But one of the accusations that we want to, or one of the questions people have about OGP is, what if I'm really good at OGP and really bad in the real world? Or certain governments say, what if I'm really good in the real world and really bad at OGP? So we wanted to tie those two things together for the first time. So what we've done is brought in third-party scores from organizations like VDEM, like World Justice Project, like Open Data Watch, to look at what governments are actually doing according to these organizations and compare that with what's in their action plan. Then we have what the implications are. Should they be playing a leadership role? This particular country might share what it's doing in freedom of association to help support nonprofit work and community organizations. On the other hand, this particular country is having problems with freedom of expression and journalism. They might want to consider ramping up their efforts in OGP or outside of it. And so we wanted to give clear action implications for what might go in future action plans or outside of action plans. Not to turn this into too much of an advertisement, but you can go online, our brand new website that was just launched the other day, and you can see, for example, how are they doing on media, this country? How are they doing on free expression? How are they doing on enforcement of human rights and follow-up? In this particular country, you can see that out of 4, they have fairly low scores in harassment by police and organized crime of journalists. So that might be an area that they might consider working. And you can see that they're having, while they're filing their human rights reports, no one's following up on those particular human rights reports. So if they wanted to advance civic space in this country, we hope that they would consider taking targeted actions in this area. Finally, the last tool that we have for you that I hope is useful is you can see who are the strong performers in these areas within OGP, who's taking the bold step. So those are, we call those share innovation countries. Which are the countries that are taking bold steps to actually tackle these issues within their OGP action plans? And who are the ones that might consider future action? It's not a ranking, it's not an index, it's just a way to help us shape our actions so that we can begin aligning our problems with our solutions much better. And so we also tried to bring in tools and cases. For example, in Serbia, the investigation into the murder of more than 30 journalists has resulted in 3 prosecutions. We hope that the good and the bad of that process might be learned from other OGP countries. And finally, we worked with UN Rapporteur's Office, various nonprofit organizations in this room, and international organizations to figure out what are some guidance that you could have turnkey recommendations and commitments for OGP action plans to use in the future to promote, for example, in this case, media pluralism and free expression.
Joe, thanks. I like the use of the term untapped potential. I think, when parents go to the parent-teacher conference and sit down and say, how's my kid doing? And the teacher says, it's just a lot of untapped potential. That means the kid's basically failing out. So it's a good term. But boiling down to the essence, would it be, it's an oversimplification, but would it be a somewhat accurate one to say that what the report finds is that OGP members are making some gains on many areas of open government work, yet in the large area of civil liberties, there's a troubling development and many of them are not. So there's a bit of a split between the civil liberties domain and many of the specific open government goals and achievements with respect to data and opening of governance in different ways. Is that an accurate sort of just headline summary of the report?
Yeah, I mean, some of the headline summaries, we might be winning at the policy areas and maybe not at the bigger environment issues. That being said, there are countries, as you could see, the civic space was still quite far up. There are a lot of potential leaders in OGP, so it's not just necessarily a commitment gap in action plans. It might also be a leadership gap to some extent. And so we'd be looking for countries to play that leadership role as well, not just action plans.
And how is both OGP as an organization, but how is OGP as an organization hoping to take forward this report? You mentioned you hope that members can use this information in these ways, but having done all of the work, and I know this was a big lift, to do this report, and anytime you try to do global assessments, inevitably a lot of people are unhappy, and also there are a lot of real analytic challenges, which I think you've surmounted. But what are your plans over the next 6 to 12 months to try to give this report some traction within the OGP membership?
Yeah, I think we've identified where the gaps are. I mean, the report, some people think it's a little heavy on the gap analysis and a little light on solutions, but it's probably a common criticism we all get. But what we hope to do is take these bright lights of innovation and be able to turn those into some kind of political coalitions. I know there was discussion, and maybe Sunita and Doug can talk about this a bit more, but the idea of having a group of leaders the way there is around open contracting, which we would have seen way far in the bottom right corner a few years ago, and we've seen political leadership by a group of 5 countries moving that forward and putting that same kind of effort into civic space on a practical level. And what this report hopes to do is to give some fuel and some fodder by making these conversations just a little less abstract and to have things that we can do in little 2-year bites, which is what we're good at over the next few months. And ideally, we can track, I hope, the shift across the map of civic space over time.
And usually when you finish a report like this, the last thing you want to do is think about doing it again. But are you planning to do a subsequent report?
Yes, funding contingent, but the goal is to have a continue report. And what's really exciting about it is, of course, we've released all the data behind it in open data format. And since all these governance data sources are continually open things, we will be updating the dynamic database probably over the next few weeks. And so everyone's scores will change. And they'll continue to be up to date over probably twice a year as we get new IRM reports. And so it'll be a living, it's more than just a paper document. It's a way of life.
Okay. Thank you. I want to turn next to Sandra Papera. Sandra, as Open Government Partnership has evolved over the years, they put a stronger and stronger emphasis on inclusion, which is obviously a very positive development. And I'd like to turn to the question of women's political empowerment. It's a subject that you and I have talked a lot about and worked together on. When we look at the overall global picture and see so many troubling trends, One could say, but look, over the last 20 years, women's political empowerment has been an encouraging area. There are a lot of gains here. Yes, there may be, some very troubling larger trends, but women's political empowerment arguably is an area of success, at least in some parts of the world. How do you, as a specialist on women's political empowerment and gender inclusion generally, how do you see the issues that you care about and you work on relating to the open government agenda and this overall analysis of the state of open government?
Thank you, Tom. I'm trying really hard to switch sort of the perspective I come at these things from what they call the deficit perspective to the asset perspective. But it's hard, because I think if you actually applied a gender lens to all that's been said by colleagues previously, you would get a very different picture of each and every issue. And there's a reason why even in Open Government Partnership, this year 2 reports have been launched. First of all, this one, which I'm told, and I haven't read, is somewhat light on the gender analysis. And then the companion report, which was also released 2 days ago under the Feminist Open Government Initiative. What I want to say is this is the area of untapped potential, actually. And anybody who'd been at the Feminist Open Government Initiative Day on Wednesday would have seen really the huge interconnectability, really, of the issues that you're dealing with. I don't want to fall into Tom's trap of all the good things come together and come in the same wave. But there are reasons why the Women's March in DC in January 2017 was not only the biggest single women's march that the United States had seen, but it was the biggest single disabilities rights march that the United States had ever seen. And in that, I have to sort of make the point that if you brace open the space for women, you brace open the space for pretty much every other demographic group, because guess what? Women are 50% of every group, not just 50%, but just 50% of every group that there is. So in that untapped potential, I think we have a place to start. I am an open government partnership neophyte. This is the first time I've ever been to this. NDI, the organization I work for, has been deep in this for many years. We've been part of the legislative opening part of it, and I know that I've got colleagues here from our Latin America department who are supporting an Ecuadorian delegation. But from the perspective of sort of gender, I think the big steps that have been made recently, and thanks to Canada and to the other partners that have supported that, will give OGP the chance to actually, in a way, recover some of the momentum around democratic renewal, which surely must be at the center of what OGP wants to do.
Tell me a little bit more about that idea of renewal and the idea of gender being a key part of that. Maybe you could just mention a few parts of the world where you see, or a specific country or a specific political juncture where you've seen gender inclusion play a role in moving a country forward that is really part of renewal.
I think the key issue is really, to paraphrase, it's the psephology, it's the numbers. You just cannot get away from the numbers. I was part of a pre-election assessment mission in Zimbabwe last year, and the electoral register had 52% of the roll was women, and they were the largest group in all provinces. In Bangladesh last year, they had 23 million new voters joined the electoral register. In Nigeria, 14 million new voters joined the electoral register between the elections. And yet the two major parties fielded, I think, less than 10 women as representatives. So I think the question is, when will leaders and governments understand the demography that's really going to be driving the agenda? The other thing about where women are is that I think Luca said more than 50% of the world is now living under some form of democratic dispensation. And the other 50%, frankly, live in China. But the key point about some parts of this is that the trend towards urbanization has a very female face as well. And so where the political centers of activity are going to be also increasingly female-faced. So I think understanding these dynamics is as important as promoting and lauding those where things are going well. And it's invidious in some ways to talk about parts of the world where things are doing better. I think people always talk about Rwanda, of course, and Rwanda's got over 60% of women in its legislature. Well, yeah. I'm not sure where Rwanda would stand on some of the indices that we've been talking about. Probably it's doing very well, but under what conditions? I mean, that's the key point. I think the first 4 countries in terms of women's political representation, 3 of them are countries that we wouldn't necessarily give all the plaudits to across all the indicators that we might look at. So I think this is really what we need to be much more careful about. And the point that you raised, Tom, about civic movements and civic space, the point that Lucan and Tom also raised about where autocrats are and populists. I mean, those spaces are even more difficult for women and even more difficult for women's organizations and movements than for men, because a lot of women come into politics through civic spaces. And closing civic space means almost automatically a reduction in space for women's movements and women's organization.
Interesting. One last question, Sandra, although we may have a chance to come back to you. In general democracy circles, there's a very common theme these days of talking about a backlash against democracy and the sense of backlash, the sudden citizens voting for candidates who really want to specifically reverse a number of gains in different areas. In the field of women's political empowerment, do you also feel like you're seeing and the movement is living through a backlash, or is it not a description that you would apply to the overall environment? I know it's a bit of a generalization, but could you?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely. Politics is the temple of masculinities in some ways. I mean, really.
It's what? Sorry, say it again.
The temple of masculinity, politics, and leadership is hugely seen as in the male traits. We had this little exercise in the Feminist Open Government Initiative 2 days ago. So not only are women, never before have we had as educated a population of any gender as we have today, and more women than ever educated. But as women step into public spaces, they are faced with actual backlash. And some of that is about the fact that, as Mary Robinson reminded us yesterday, frankly, men have got to give way. I think we need a new badge, like the traffic sign. It should just say "give way," and get people to just give way, get out of the way, make more space. And we're not saying that men shouldn't be in power, but just fewer of you should be in power. That's the point. That's the point. And if we don't get to that, we don't then get that wave of beneficial and efficacious governance that we're looking for. I am a feminist. Sorry, long-term feminist, and what I understand about this is that gender equality, which is actually the feminist goals, gender equality, liberates all of us from harmful gendered practices. And that's where we need to get to. And understanding that and actually describing that, supporting those who are prepared to champion that is a big part of what we all need to do going forward.
Thank you. You know, I think central to OGP's evolution, both as an organization and really as a community, is filling out the concept of open government with real meaning in terms of societies and life. And what you've just said is a way that I think, you know, we throw around terms easily like participation and inclusiveness, but you're describing the real texture of what it means for the OGP movement to go beyond, you know, a simple technocratic narrow conception of open government to something that really has meaning to people.
And you know, really, the power of three, but I'm going to give you four. It's about movements, yes, and understanding how the women's movements are under duress. They're fragile, but they're actually very resilient too. It's a sort of a oxymoron in that way. But you can't keep loading the same women's movements with new agendas. And we need to have a streamlining of some of these issues. I was doing a quick sort of back of paper thing. You know, so the Open Government Partnership has got principles. We've got, I'm sure, Sinise is going to talk about NRG principles. There are good ID principles. NDI has an open electoral data initiative that's got principles in it. I mean, how are we going to actually manage to get these principles aligned so that they fit Russian doll style together? So there's something about movements, there's something about monitoring and actually paying attention in a, with all due respect, more nuanced way to the differentiated impacts and the differentiated strategies needed to make some of these issues live for women and other marginalized populations. So there's a monitoring piece. There's money, please. Thank you, Canada, but more money to women's organizations and more money behind the initiatives that should be delivering on gender commitments. I know we've heard it all the last 3 days. Only 2% of OGB commitments are sort of gendered, but only 13% of them, 13% of the 2% are assessed to have be actually actionable. I mean, that's pretty poor. So, you know, these are the sorts of issues. And then finally, mean it. Mean it. Seriously, if I have to go to one more global summit where the inclusion plenary stands between the delegates and their drinks at the end of a day, I will scream, really scream. But these are the ways in which OGB could set a different path and different agenda. You need to mean that this is something that's important to you all. And so, yeah, no more inclusion plenaries at 4 o'clock at the end of the first day.
Okay. All right. Doug Rutson, I want to turn to you now, and I think I want to zero in on an issue that really, as I mentioned in my discussion with Joe Foti, that really stands out, which is that we have a picture of a world in which a number of OGP members are making progress on OGP goals. Yet then we have a fairly daunting chart that says most OGP countries are moving backward on civic liberties. Are we living in a world of opening government or closing space? Help us understand the contradiction, or at least the tension between those two visions.
Thanks, Tom. As I consider your question, I'm reminded of the story of the Mughal emperor, Jahangir. And when he ascended to the throne in India in 1605, what was the first thing he did? He erected a golden chain. He put 60 bells up. And any person could come and shake the chain and get an audience with the emperor. Imperial China did the same thing. They called it a grievance drum. And now they've opened a portal where millions of citizens put up e-petitions. King Abdullah is known for dressing as a taxi driver and trying to hear directly from citizens. And I present these examples because I think it helps explain the dualism that you mentioned. I think governments of all political persuasions, whether they're autocracies or democracies, actually find it useful to hear from citizens about what's happening in their country. They also don't like unchecked corruption. They like controlled corruption. So it's very, very helpful to them. And so what we find is throughout history, throughout geography, governments are often opening up the space for individual contact with citizens, but they get really nervous when citizens start to organize, when they have that capacity to challenge power. So as a result, what we find around the world, including in OGP countries, is this dualism where they open up space for individual engagement with citizens, very non-threatening. In fact, it's good because you get better public services, less corruption. You might even have more authoritarian legitimacy that way. But they close the space for organized civil society because that can threaten power.
Okay. What does that idea or conclusion lead you to think about what OGP could or should do to do better on this front then? Where does that thinking take you?
Well, building on Lucan's point, I think that in some sense we're being exposed to a political Rorschach test. You know those psychological tests where you put up this really ambiguous ink blot and they say, what do you see? And I think for each of us, the question is, as you look around the world, what do you see? How do you feel? Are you an optimist? Are you a pessimist? When it comes to electoral democracy, do you recognize that magician's trick where they get you to focus on the outcome and ignore all the manipulation behind the scenes that again gives the illusion of electoral legitimacy? When you think of the challenges in the world today, have you been conditioned to believe that it's not your job, or you don't have the power to make change? Or do you recognize, in fact, that every one of us has that capacity? And I have to say that as I'm here at OGP, I'm leaving more inspired than I was before, because I've met lots of colleagues sitting here today who actually are recognizing that they do have agency, they do have the power, that there's no one but us to defend democracy, and they're willing to do it. But sort of concluding where I began, it's not enough that we do that individually, we need to do that collectively. So I think in terms of what can OGP do, 3 C's. 1, consultations. When you go home, we should figure out a way to get consultation specifically on the issue of civic space. What are the challenges for civil society? What can we do about it? 2, commitment. We need to have, as Joe indicated, more commitments around civic space. 3, coalitions. Great coalition around beneficial ownership. I know some governments are looking for how can they play a leadership role at OGP. This is an easy one. Why don't you come out, help us build a coalition around civic space? And then cross-cutting all of this, I think we have to be really careful about not falling into the authoritarian trap of simply reacting to their political agenda. We have to learn from Dr. Martin Luther King, who didn't affect social justice by saying, I have a problem. He had a dream. And I think what we need to do is build out a vision of where we want to be. We have to have a proactive agenda. We have to use OGP to fulfill that vision. And I think that together we'll be able to help write that history to protect civic space.
Thanks, Doug. In a way, that's a natural segue to what I wanted to ask Sunita Kaimal. Sunita, you've been very involved with OGP, but in the civil society side, not on the governmental side. So I know you must have accumulated some thinking about the evolution of OGP and where it is today and where it should go, both on this challenge of civic liberties, which is really fundamental to open government and a fundamental challenge, but probably more generally as well. So I'd like you to take the thinking further about how OGP you think can address some of the problems that we're facing in the world and where it can evolve as a community.
Thanks very much, Tom. I've been reflecting as each of the panelists has been speaking and wondering whether to a certain extent we have been kind of marinating in this atmosphere of doom and gloom instead of recognizing that there is a specific moment that exists now where we need to really solidify democracy. We knew that this was going to be a hard journey. There's never been a premise that open government was easy. But I think that we need to recognize the assets that we have as well as the challenges that we face. And it may not be very sexy, but I think what we need is a lot of patience and a lot of fortitude to see through this vision of open government going forward. But I do query how we as OGP can claim that we're having meaningful impact when I see the statistics around civic space and the backsliding that exists, when this is the fundamental ingredient of open government. And I think this really is a moment where we need to pivot in some very specific ways if we are going to elevate the potential of OGP and actually see its full impact. So I'd like to present a few ideas really building on much of what the panelists spoke of as well. I think first we need to recognize what the specific added value of OGP is and what it is not. Lucan spoke of the activation of citizens, and I think that OGP can really be a bridge or a channel for the energy of citizens that right now may feel very angry or incoherent. But this is a path to be able to channel that energy into concerted engagement and into concerted action of a positive nature. There is no other space where government and civil society are talking about these issues together. And there is no other space where there is such a concrete mechanism for action and for the kind of accountability and learning that we see through things like the State of Open Government report. And this platform of evidence and learning, I think, is really key. Reflecting on some of the earlier comments, I think there's a certain arrogance that is attached to populism that frankly is not rooted in any evidence base that that is a better form of government. And to the contrary, we, through OGP and through the actions outside of OGP as well, are getting to know where we have real strengths and where we are falling short. And I love the idea of untapped potential. I think that sums up so much of what we could do together. I want to emphasize we need to continue to track and learn what is working and what's not. We have 8 years of solid evidence, but there's so much more that we can learn from. But now what we need to do is pivot from discussing these as problems and really focusing on what we see are the key solutions. And I think now we have a particular diagnostic tool or set of tools at our disposal to do that. So one clear mechanism, to state the obvious, is the national action plans. These are the right tool for action, and yet they're hugely underutilized. The co-creation process itself does expand and protect civic space in certain ways, but to reinforce those gains, we do need concrete commitments in the areas of untapped potential, particularly those of civil liberties. And the reason is not only because there is a specific need to protect and defend civic space, but as Sandra said, that there are these spillover effects. Fundamentally, we cannot be advancing the many themes that we hope to work on, whether natural resource governance or beneficial ownership or open contracting or service delivery, if you don't fundamentally consider how civic space will be impacted or will impact the success of those objectives. So there's a certain level of intersectionality that we really need to consider in the national action plans, but for me, the core of those intersections is really civic space. So we're talking about the need to put in place concrete commitments related to freedoms of assembly and association and expression, but also commitments that amplify others through the protection of civic space. The second pivot we need to make, or the second opportunity I see, is to get the right actors into the room, Too often within OGP, we are talking with a very narrow subset of government. And oftentimes, it's not the right actors who actually can enact civic space changes or need to be the critical partners as we are thinking about threats to closing civic space. Just to give you a concrete example, if we're looking at the registration or the money flows to civil society, we need to be engaging with the tax authorities. Those are often not part of the OGP conversation. Similarly, where are the justice initiatives? Where's the access to justice? Where are the opportunities to have conversations with those stakeholders as well? But we also need to be expanding the role of civil society beyond the traditional OGP, open data, transparency, and accountability actors. There's a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge, and a wealth of power. Sandra, you spoke of the women's movements. I totally agree with you. We can't keep tapping the same movements, but there is a form of solidarity and power that comes from entering into this community and having a multiplier effect where we can reinforce the ambitions of those movements as well, while drawing strength, knowledge, and expertise from them at the same time. I think we also need to look, thirdly, at the right leaders. And I think that we have defaulted too often to the usual suspects when it comes to leadership. I couldn't agree more with Joe and Doug's points about the importance of collective leadership on civic space. And fundamentally, I very much agree that we are in a reactive mode to a populist narrative instead of creating, defining a vision and ambition for open government that is not just in reactive mode, but really sets a proactive agenda with civic space at the very core. I think if we can do that, if we can harness the collective action and the collective courage of government and civil society leaders in civic space, then we really will be able to achieve the true impact of the Open Government Partnership.
Sunita, you know, Sunita was a late addition to the panel because actually we had been hoping that Canada's Foreign Minister, Minister Freeland, was going to be able to be with us today, but she got called to Parliament this morning. But the good news is she's going to be back. She is going to be here at noon on a media freedom panel. I think she'll be moderating or taking part in that panel, so don't miss her there. But we didn't fall short, Sunita, having you here. We did equally well, although the minister is terrific. I want to come back. We have just a little less, about 10 minutes, a little bit less. I want to pick up a few points. I want to go back to you, Joe. Now, you speak at OGP for research, not for the whole organization, so I don't want to put you on the spot. But you've heard some interesting things from Sandra, from Doug, from Sunita about ways that OGP can move forward. What does that make you think in terms of the research agenda, in terms of using it, developing it, and OGP's evolution?
In terms of the research agenda, and in terms of OGP, I mean, the ideas that Doug and Sunita put forward are really, we're beginning to see that that's what works in OGP. There are models that work there. So the goal of the research at OGP is to supply them with the fuel that they need, the food for what they're doing. So I think the research agenda will continue to be a combination of identifying who assets are. I really like that framing, as well as deficits. There are areas that we need to expand on. I think we were able to touch on this mostly thanks to some of the great research ICNL has done, for example, on the differential impacts of freedom of association laws on marginalized communities and on HIV/AIDS, for example. If anyone hasn't read that report, they should. So I think there are areas for us to expand. There are also areas where we need partners to step up with some of the governance data that responds to some of these needs, because this was a synthesis report. Very little original research was done. It was a combination of what's out there, and the gap in, say, for example, gender and inclusion data is kind of reflected in the report because that was what we could find. So the future would be to cover more of these areas. I think it's also to begin building a few more bridges with human rights communities and people who have been working on this for decades and decades, but might be alienated by our strange mechanisms or jargon of our own, as much as our community might not be familiar with theirs. So I think that act of translation is as much a part of the research as anything between those potential communities.
Thank you. Yeah, you hit on something there at the end that I think is really crucial. One of the reasons I asked Sandra to join the panel was, although I understand there are 2,500 people registered for the OGP Summit, this is Sandra's first summit. And you know, somebody as interesting and important as she is and the work that she does needs to be part of this. No, I'm saying that it's a big community, but it still needs to be a bigger community. And we need to think about how to do that. And I was going to ask you, Sandra, if you have any more thoughts, and also whether you see some examples of you get invited to other such meetings, other kinds of communities. Are there places you might point to and say, they're doing really well, at least on some part of this, of the gender inclusion in a way that you think is worthwhile?
Well, I was inspired.
Hold on, I'm not sure if it's, let's see. Yeah, I just didn't make sure you're speaking right into it. I didn't really hear.
No.
Yeah, why don't you take Joe's microphone? Thanks.
So I was inspired by what Joe just said with regards to research. And I think, again, you know, the need to be purposeful about this is really, really important, because otherwise, you know, as they say, rubbish in, rubbish out. One of the ways in which we could look at this from another way, and I take the point about this being a community, but nobody is just OGP. You know, there are connectabilities and there are connections to other communities and things. And one of the, as I was thinking about this panel, one of the areas I was looking at was this whole idea of, you know, how might open government processes do something around gender equality and women's representation in politics. If you just perhaps put the filter of the Women, Business and Law compendium. Do people know about this? Women, Business and Law compendium. It's a World Bank compendium of all the laws that prevent women's full integration into the economy, into politics and so forth. You know, if you actually looked at some of the indicators you've got going here through that lens, I think it would illuminate quite a bit. You know, there are still 2.7 billion women in the world who are not able to apply for the same jobs as men. There are still 37 countries in the world where women cannot apply for a passport in their own name. Now, how does that sort of barrier influence women's ability to engage in conversations around open government? The 2018 Women, Business and Law report suggested that those countries where women's agency is higher in their private and personal space are also countries with higher levels of women's representation in the political space. Maybe an obvious point, but actually uncovering that and speaking to that is important, because if you have a score under Women, Business and Law of more than 100, then you probably have 24% women in your parliament. Less than 100 means you're down to 17%. And of course, globally, 24% means that 75% of the parliamentarians in this world are men, of which some 65% are over the age of 45. So, you know, the lens through which we're looking at these issues, I think, needs that calibration. And I think that there are ways in which looking at how some of the gender inclusion indices are being built and literally applying them as a filter to some of the work that OGP does will give us, again, more nuance and more a clearer pathway forward. I wanted also
one more minute. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the points made earlier on around how we defend this democracy. I think Afrobarometer did a really interesting study a few months back when they surveyed, you know, as usual, 34 countries in Africa. It said 68% of people in Africa who were surveyed were still in favor of democracy. But the key point, and I think this is, again, an important a group of people that we need to reach and activate, are those less than 16% who were prepared, they're called dissatisfied Democrats. They are prepared to defend the democracy. That's the group of people we need to energize. And in that same Afrobarometer survey, it said that women were much less likely to demand democracy. So again, how are we reaching those people? How are we giving them the data they need? How are we actually moving beyond open data to actual open governance principles? Those are the things I think that are going to be important.
Excellent, thanks. Let me just wrap things up. We have about 2 minutes. So we've been on a three-part journey here this morning. First, Luca and I have been setting the scene and trying to change the narrative a bit away from a simplistic narrative of democratic gloom and authoritarian victory to show that it's actually a complex moment. And that first chart that Lucan showed really highlighted the fact that this is, at least by some measures, a much more complex moment with good news and bad news intermixed. So we're trying to set the scene and show that we really need to go inside the headlines and really bring out the question of what is the relationship of the larger global trends to the open government agenda. Then second part of the discussion, we turned to Joe and really got an update on how OGP has evolved in its research work and really come forward after 7 or 8 years with a very significant both research product but an assessment tool that can be useful both for members and for activists and for others, and how OGP can take that tool forward. Now that it's established it, then you can refine it, build on it, do subsequent work based on it, but it's a really significant development, not just in a research sense for OGP, but in defining, really taking seriously the evolution of the open government concept towards inclusion, participation, accountability. So I think this research tool is crucial to that. And then the third part of our journey, we turned to Sandra and Doug and Sunita with some ideas about what does it mean to take the open government agenda forward in some really significant ways. Doug had some very specific ideas, the 3 C's, consultation, commitment, and coalition. I even remember them, which is a good sign that these have a natural coherence and importance. And then Sunita with 3 pivots, which were also very useful. And then Sandra, a mandate for really thinking seriously about inclusiveness, not just through a gender lens, but how gender illuminates all areas of inclusion. So we really have a rich agenda of moving forward as well. So it's a bit of a journey this morning, and I want to thank you. I'd like to mention that the Carnegie Endowment, we're taking forward in partnership with OGP, we're doing a few articles that we're spinning off the OGP report to give further life to it. So we're doing a piece on the issue I posed to Doug of the relationship between open government and closing civic space that my colleague Saskia Rechenmacher will be publishing in the next few weeks with us. I've done a piece on the international leadership vacuum and how we should think about that vacuum in the current context. And then my colleague Richard Youngs in Europe is doing a piece on new participatory mechanisms in Europe and whether or not we see some real advance in participation in response to closing space trends. So we'll try to give some additional analytic and sort of public life to these issues through our own work. I want to thank everyone, thank our hardworking panelists, and thank all of you, and look forward to the next discussion.
To conclude our series of lightning talks in this room, please welcome from the Public Service Accountability Monitor in South Africa, Zukiswa Kota, who will be speaking about a democratic trust-building project in her country, empowering citizens to monitor public funds. Pour nous parler d'un projet démocratique visant à promouvoir l'engagement des citoyens envers l'utilisation transparente des fonds publics, veuillez accueillir de l'Afrique du Sud, Zukiswa Kota.
This is a story of co-creation. It's a story about trust building between a South African government department and civil society organizations. Many South Africans in the room may well be familiar with the notion of a rainbow nation. This was the image that was used to depict the euphoria that would lead us into a democratic dispensation after 1994. At the other end of the South African rainbow lay a promise of equality, a promise of quality health, access to education, and a range of the fundamental rights enshrined in the Constitution. It was also a promise of accountable governance of the country's financial resources, a promise of open, inclusive decision-making where all people could be involved. But we aren't there yet, far from it. I live in the Eastern Cape, a province arguably the poorest in the country, riddled by high levels of unemployment and inequality and debilitating poverty. A province in which service delivery is poor and where many people have limited access to and involvement in decisions that have a direct impact in their lives. It's also, positively, the province where arguably one of our most famous leaders was born, the greatest proponent of open government, Nelson Mandela. Despite really strong public finance management legislation and a good number of committed public officials and high levels of budget transparency, it does still seem that corruption is slowly but surely eroding the promise at the other end of the rainbow. It also seems that, in addition to this, many South Africans are being left out of the decision-making process and don't have a voice, the very people meant to benefit. For several years now, the National Treasury has sought to engage civic actors in the budget and the budget process. But despite these engagements and, as I say, high levels of fiscal transparency, there does seem to be a chasm between that and public participation. So in partnership with the National Treasury, a group of civil society organizations came together to develop an online budget data portal called Vulega Mali. Loosely translated, Vulega Mali means to open up the money or to open up the coffers. The objective, to go beyond transparency and to involve the users or the ultimate users of budget data, to empower civic actors to make sense of, make use of, and interrogate what the state puts out in terms of fiscal information. But getting there wasn't easy. And the exciting element is the fact of many civil society organizations slowly to come back to the table and engage in the process of informing the development of Vulega Mali, which was launched not too long ago, 2018, in response to the country's OGP commitment to open budgeting. But the journey was a challenging one. Many civic actors were heavily jaded by what they felt might be a waste of investment or wasted investment of time and resources in a process that could likely just be a tick box exercise by another government department, which would be meaningless in the long run. More perniciously, other actors were particularly skeptical about engaging with a surveillance state, a state in which many journalists and CSOs were being spied on, further eroding trust. Lastly, political instability and what is now well-publicized internal battles within the ministry also likely placed very important officials, reformers, under severe strain within the ministry. So what has this shown us? It's shown us that reform has to be supported not just from within government, but very much from outside. It's shown us that more than engaging and making sure of a diversity of voices, that we must embrace even the least likely seeming of reformers, whoever they may be. But the innovation lies not in the technical tool itself, the fantastic budget data portal. In my opinion, the real innovation lies in the quality and the form of co-creation that we've taken. That, while largely organic, has been one way of interrogating the various ways in which real open government could really look like. So the Vulega Mali team consists of a range of government departments led by the National Treasury, as well as a group of civil society organizations with diverse backgrounds, interests, and focus areas. So around this table, do we have a shared perspective of meaningful participation? The answer very often is no. But the important thing is that that's not where the debate ends, and that's where the debate shouldn't end. The Vulega Mali project also sets out a very ambitious set of objectives. Ambitious and time-consuming, resource-intensive, and more often than not, politically complex. A former member of the project team once used the following analogy to talk about the innovation and the complexity of the project. Dr. Kay Brown, and she said that the project was like making chocolate, when you have no idea what chocolate is supposed to taste like or what it should even look like. And that can be very frustrating, even with the best laid plans in place. That's why we need very meaningful relationships based on mutual trust and respect. But those relationships are also what's needed to ensure that vibrant and robust debate is supported and doesn't throw a spanner in the works. That takes time to develop. It also takes time to develop the kind of meaningful, inclusive participation that we seek to ensure around the country. And so, ultimately, one of the most exciting and inspiring elements of this project hasn't been so much the shiny tool, which it is, and I encourage you to go online. It has been, in fact, the relationship building and the paradigm shifts that have happened along the way in our ways of working and understanding. It's been the inclusion of a much broader range of civic actors who are slowly coming back to the table. It's been ensuring that we engage beneficiaries and users of data and communities who would never otherwise engage with public data across the country. So ultimately, by building trust, we can reignite our rainbow. Thank you.
A few housekeeping notes for you. Of course, you can visit our sponsors on the second level and refreshments available for you on every floor. We are very pleased to announce that the Honorable Chrystia Freeland, Minister of Foreign Affairs, will be joining us at the noon session in this room on media freedom and access to information, which is organized by the British High Commissioner to Canada. So we hope that you can all join us then. And one last final note. Tonight, as you know, is our closing reception at the Museum of History, which will be starting at 8. We really encourage you to come because it's going to be a great close to a fantastic summit. If you are from the Ottawa region and you have some friends, you can invite them to come along. You can network, you can make new friends from across the world. And the only thing that you need to do if you'd like to bring extra guests is to register them at Eventbrite. So we really hope that you will come en masse to this fantastic party that we've got organized for you. There's going to be music, there's going to be dancing. You want to be there tonight. There will be shuttles that leave here starting at 7:30 so that you can go and enjoy the evening and have a great time and not have to worry about driving home. So we hope to see you there. We will be starting our next session in a few minutes. In the interim, please feel free to go grab a coffee, a tea, and come right back. Thank you.
Alma. Ve ad dansı yapıyoruz. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to you. My name's Tim Sebastian, and I have the privilege of moderating this important session on how to balance national security and democratic values. As you know, this is an issue that doesn't go away, and it shouldn't. As a journalist, I've worked for more than 40 years in far too many countries where national security has become a tool for disposing of democratic values, not reinforcing them. Anyone can have that kind of security these days, but it's much harder to have the other kind that protects those rights and freedoms that we in the West understand as democracy. For that to happen, though, our system requires public trust in our security agencies and the confidence that our laws are being respected. It requires those agencies to be subject to robust, independent oversight, supported by the courts and a strong civil society, and that hasn't always been the case. At the same time, our security services need their own protections in the dangerous environment in which they operate. Their identities and their methods have to be kept secret. So how do we manage those competing demands? No simple answers, but I'm hoping that our panel and you, the audience, will be able to share some ideas on that with us. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to talk to you for a maximum of 10 minutes. We'll then see where the fault lines lie, if we can, between them. And then I'd like to bring you, the audience, into the discussion as well to hear your views for the rest of our time. Alexander Joel is Chief Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the U.S. Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Welcome to you, sir. Would you like to take the floor, please?
Sure, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk to you guys. Hopefully people, if they're coming in, can move in toward the center, give us a bit of a cozier feel here. So yes, indeed, I am the Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the Director of National Intelligence, and for those of you who don't follow the bureaucracy of our national security services in the United States, I'll just give a brief, very brief background. The Director of National Intelligence is an organization that was created after 9/11. After the 9/11 attacks in the United States in 2001. It was created by the statute known as the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. And the reason was the 9/11 Commission, a commission that had been established at that time to look into the attacks, felt that the intelligence agencies in the United States had information that they did not share, and had they done a better job of sharing that information with each other and with other organizations in government, we would have stood a better chance of preventing those attacks. And so they created this new office called the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The first director, Ambassador John Negroponte, took over was sworn in April of 2005. I joined the ODNI in June of 2005, essentially in the same job that I hold now. So I've been in the same position for 14 years. Under 5 directors of national intelligence and 3 administrations. So that gives me a bit of a perspective on what's happened at least in the United States and in our relations with our partners on the national security front during that time period. There's been a lot of change. I've been in the same job, but there's been a lot of changes in the world, and the job itself has changed over time. So the job of the Director of National Intelligence is to better lead and coordinate the 17 elements of the intelligence community inside the United States. My job is in the statute, the Civil Liberties Protection Officer position, and it is to work with intelligence agencies to make sure that we are integrating appropriate protections for privacy and civil liberties into our activities, our programs, our policies, and our procedures. It's not my job alone. It's a job that is shared by a lot of folks in the intelligence community. We have lawyers, we have offices of Inspector General, there are oversight personnel, compliance folks, and of course everybody, I believe, in the intelligence community has this job as well. They take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. We have a retaking of the oath ceremony every year to reinforce among our workforce that it is everyone's job to stay true to the constitutional principles of liberty and justice. So one of the main changes that's happened recently is transparency. And let me explain that a little bit, and that's really the focus here at this conference. In the United States, we have a framework for rules and oversight in terms of how we conduct our intelligence activities, how we restrict them, how we make sure they are properly overseen. And as I said, there are a lot of folks involved in that process. We also have oversight entities. Some of them are specialized ones that were created after 9/11, such as the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which I can talk more about, to specifically oversee our activities to make sure we're doing them in the proper way. It's a complicated system. It's a system of many layers with many players. It's interlocking. It's what I consider an expert system. And I think it, by and large, works in the manner that it is intended to work. There are, of course, areas where we can always improve that system. So that was a system we were operating under for many years. And a key part of that is oversight. And that oversight is sometimes, we can think of it as a secret oversight. And we have a secret court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and we have committees in Congress that have clearance to see information. And we have, like I said, the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. They are secret only in the sense that they have access to classified information. So I think secret oversight is essential in a democracy. Not that the oversight itself is secret, but that they have the clearance to see everything they need to see in order to make sure that our activities are being conducted properly. So they cannot be excluded based on a national security concern or because something is classified. They have cleared personnel, they have cleared facilities, they have secure computer systems. And then we have to work with them to make sure they have the information they need to carry out their activities. Well, a few years ago, we had a crisis in confidence. There was unauthorized disclosures back in 2013. And it seemed very clear to us that the system that we had established of rules and oversight operating by and large, on a classified environment was absolutely necessary, but it wasn't sufficient. What we were missing was more information being available to the public. So we really focused on how can we be more transparent with the public while still protecting sources and methods. Because, as you said, secrecy is essential for intelligence services. A fully transparent intelligence service would be fully ineffective. So we need to be able to keep our sources and methods secret. We need to protect the lives of the people in other countries who are providing information to us and our partners in other countries. And we need to maintain the secrecy around the methods we use so that we can remain effective in detecting the actions of adversaries who are seeking to undermine the security of our nation and our partners. So it's a very difficult challenge. We approached it in a couple of different ways. So immediately in 2013, we started trying to release more information. Initially, we started with general statements saying, we follow the law, here are the rules. Not surprisingly, a statement by itself was not particularly persuasive in the public discussion. And what quickly became evident was that we needed to release the underlying documents themselves. So we undertook a fairly massive effort to look at the underlying documents that were being discussed or that pertain to the topics being discussed in the public, and trying to find a way to release those documents in a manner that continued to protect sources and methods. And so we started releasing redacted documents, and we found that while helpful, those documents, again, standing alone, were not very effective because people didn't understand them. They were, in some cases, overly redacted to the point that it was hard to read. And even when they weren't that redacted, it was difficult to understand what they were saying because these were complicated, technical, legal, primarily legalistic conversations that were going on in the course of these documents. So we realized that we have to also release explanations of the documents. Now, the explanations were themselves a challenge because you want to be accurate, you don't want to misstate what the documents say, but at the same time, you want to try to explain it in more simple terms. And again, we found a little more success in terms of enhancing public understanding, but ultimately what we decided that we had to do was engage more proactively and regularly with civil society, with the experts on the outside who were keenly interested in what those documents said, to make sure they understood what the documents said, so that we could at least, if we were going to disagree on the same set of facts. So it wasn't as if we were being criticized for things we weren't doing. I would prefer to be criticized for things we are doing than for things we're not doing, because it's much harder to have a conversation with somebody if you have a disagreement around the basic fundamental facts. So we have a Tumblr website called IC on the Record. If you guys Google IC on the Record, you can find it. That's the primary platform we've been using to release our documents. We've created a new website recently called intel.gov, which features a lot more storytelling, days in the life of particular intelligence officers. It also has a search capability that we've added so you can do full text search of all the documents that we have released pertaining to our surveillance authorities. I'll say one last thing. The sort of path that we followed in terms of how we've tried to integrate this into our culture and to our policy structure has been, we started with general principles. We call them the principles of intelligence transparency. From there, we built it and executed on an implementation plan, building momentum and understanding and awareness of our transparency effort across the 17 elements of the intelligence community. We created an Intelligence Transparency Council of members of those elements. And then we have revised our core governing document for civil liberties and privacy and added transparency to it as well. So that's our Intelligence Community Directive 107, was issued by DNI, reissued by Director Coates, my current boss, to now include transparency as well as civil liberties and privacy, recognizing that all three are really important for public trust. And most recently, we have put it into our national intelligence strategy. This is a very important document that organizes the work of all of our intelligence community. It is now one of our 7 foundational enterprise objectives. Privacy, civil liberties, and transparency is our 7th enterprise objective for the intelligence community for the next 5 years, or I think it's 4 years. It's a quadrennial process. So we think that's essential, and we've folded that commitment to implement on that enterprise objective as our open government plan commitment going forward. So that's it.
Alex Joel, thank you very much indeed. With all the efforts that you and various other people in the intelligence communities have made to be more transparent, it took until May 2018 to discover that the Freedom Act was sweeping up phone and text records that the NSA had no lawful basis to receive. The agency deleted hundreds of millions of logs, which were gathered since 2015. Why did it take so long with all the efforts that you were making?
So I don't think that was long at all. I think that it's in fact an example of the transparency work. So because we were all committed to transparency, when NSA discovered that problem and made its efforts to make sure initially that it had reviewed and investigated the issue and then informed our appropriate oversight bodies to make sure they were understanding of what the problem was and what we were trying to do to fix it. They then went public, of course, with our support and explained to the public that the problem had occurred and what they had done to fix it, and we thought it was a laudable step that they had undertaken. I do have a counterpart at NSA. She is the head of their Civil Liberties, Privacy, and Transparency office there. She reports directly to the director of NSA. And I think NSA has really incorporated the lesson that transparency is an essential part of what we need to do going forward. So sometimes, being public about things that you do that aren't, success stories, but in fact there's a compliance problem or some issue that they faced can be a very difficult thing to do. But NSA really didn't hesitate and went public with that as soon as we were able to.
But we still don't know if that system analyzing phone and text logs of American subscribers is actually finished, do we?
We are not able to confirm that yet. That's correct.
Why
we
not?
Can't. So there's a deliberative process that is underway in the government on that issue. And as I think people here know who are familiar with the Freedom of Information laws, et cetera, there's typically an exemption for deliberative processes. And so we certainly apply that to our proactive transparency efforts. We want to encourage the deliberative process to go forward. We can't go public too early on something that is still being debated, because then you impact the space that's needed for people to have the kinds of conversations you want them to have to make sure good decisions are being made. So we're not a reality show. We don't have TV cameras following people around inside the intelligence community, but we are trying to make thoughtful and as prompt as we can decisions about what to be transparent about.
The way some of those decisions are communicated, though, I mean, earlier this year it was left to a senior Republican congressional aide, a man called Luke Murray, who's the House Minority Leader's national security advisor, to tell us that the NSA had not been using this system for months, but he didn't say it was over for good.
I won't comment further on that. I don't really have anything more to say. It's still a deliberative process within the government. And one of the things about transparency is that we have to have the trust of the people in the intelligence agencies in order to do our work and to be transparent when we can. So that means that I know a lot of different things that are going on, and I know different classified information and even deliberative information that may not be classified. I am going to be one of the people who is most strict about respecting those rules, so that people understand that they can come to me and we can have those conversations, and I'm not going to release information until it's gone through the appropriate channels. So that's really, so I do respect the deliberative process that we're still underway on that.
Do you think the American public should be told more than it's being told at the moment, even taking into account your efforts?
So certainly with the USA Freedom Act up for reauthorization, we do need to make sure that the public and Congress have the information they need to make a decision on reauthorization. That decision is still, it's not due until the end, the vote isn't due until the end of the year. So certainly by then, we should have as much information as we can along the lines that you suggested out for the public.
You're a civil liberties protection officer in an administration that has apparently not shown much overt interest in those liberties at home or abroad. Are you winning many battles behind the scenes?
So I think I'll let Director Coates speak for us on that front, where he has said that it's our mission to seek and speak the truth. And so that is what the intelligence community is focused on. We're focused on our national security mission, and we are continuing to do that work. No one has told me to stop. No one has told me I can't publish information anymore. In fact, as I've mentioned, it's in our national intelligence strategy under Director Coates. It's something that we are pursuing. We just released an annual statistical transparency report on our FISA, use of FISA and related authorities, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which I think is the most detailed report that we've released to date. We engaged with reporters on it. We continue to look for opportunities to engage with civil society. I know that the civil society folks are eager to continue to talk to us about this very issues that you're talking to us about.
But are you winning battles?
As I said, we're continuing to work. No one has told us not to. So I haven't had a battle that I had to fight yet under this administration to do the work that we're setting out to do in terms of transparency, civil liberties, and privacy.
All right, Alexander Joel, thank you very much indeed. Let me turn next to Alexander Carlyle, Lord Carlyle of Berriew. He's been a Queen's Counsel for 35 years and is a former independent reviewer of terrorism legislation in the United Kingdom. Lord Carlyle, welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning. I'm going to talk about layers of scrutiny, using the UK as an example, not as the example, but as an example. But before I get to my theme of layers of scrutiny, I actually would very much like to put to death the way in which a terminological inexactitude is used all the time in this debate, and that's the word transparency. As Tim Sebastian said in the very first part of his introduction, we are never going to have full transparency of national security issues. Our task is to have the highest possible level of accountability for national security issues, and I think that is what the serious debate is about. In the British context, there is a test, and it's a very simple test, for whether the layers of scrutiny are appropriate, and that is the test of proportionality. We have something in the UK called judicial review, the judicial review of administrative action. It's the fastest growing aspect of the law, and it has been growing exponentially for the last 40 to 50 years. The cases are cheap to bring, and they're often supported by NGOs. We have some absolutely superb libertarian NGOs in the UK, of which Tough Jowl is a representative here on this panel. So, how do we provide scrutiny which is sufficient and proportionate? Well, we have a number of layers. As Tim said, I used to be the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. That is a one-person statutory post required by British law, and it's usually, well, it always has been so far, a senior lawyer. Do they appoint someone to do that who is already co-opted into the national security space? Well, I can tell you that I knew nothing or almost nothing about terrorism when I was asked to do that job in 2001, and I have absolutely never been a member of any security service. However, what they do and what they guarantee is that that person has total independence, has a voice, advises not only on compliance with, for example, civil liberties issues, but actually advises the government statutorily on the necessity or desirability for new counter-terrorism law or on counter-terrorism law proposed by the government for the time being. And I actually served at a time of the Blair government, a Labour government, and then the coalition government of Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and I used to be a Liberal Democrat MP at one time. I was actually appointed on the 11th of September 2001, but before it all happened, in the morning, UK time. And then 9/11 occurred. I had expected, when I was asked to do the job, to do 5 or 10 days a year, all connected with Northern Ireland. In the afternoon, the relevant minister telephoned me and came out with the memorable words which still ring in my ears, "Alex, we think it'll take up a bit more time now." And in fact, in my first year, it took 170 days of my time. I was offered the opportunity to do it full-time, which would have involved a pension, which would have been rather attractive. But I decided not to, and so did my 2 and now 3 successors, because a new one was appointed 2 days ago, because I did not want my independence to be compounded by the fact that the government would then be giving me a pension. They did pay fees, but I decided how many days I did and then told them how much to pay. Now, one of the points of telling you that is that on the very day I was appointed, the counter-terrorism situation evolved rather dramatically. Most political things in the United Kingdom evolve at about the same rate as the human species. But not this, because in a day, the world changed. Actually, the British security apparatus, of course, they knew about Al-Qaeda, but they didn't know much about Al-Qaeda. They had to learn fast. And then in 2005, there was something known in the UK as 7/7, which was a terrorist attack that involved 52 people being killed mostly on public transport in London, including a terrible event in the London Underground. And that, again, ratcheted up, evolved suddenly what we had to deal with. And when I became independent reviewer, we knew nothing about Daesh. And now Daesh, or as the BBC, Tim's former employers like to call it, so-called Islamic State, completely changed the nature of the process. The point of telling you that is that I think we have to have a scrutiny system which is not just proportionate, but capable of evolution. So what do we have? Apart from the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, we have the Intelligence and Security Committee. It's a committee made up of parliamentarians, but it's not a committee of parliament, which is able to look at anything it wishes, and like the independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, is fully security vetted, so can look at absolutely anything. And I probably need to say to you that I asked to look at many things, some of which the security services were a little reluctant to show me, but I always saw everything I wanted to see. And then we have an Investigatory Powers Commissioner. The Investigatory Powers Commissioner has a very wide-ranging role and a very large staff and some deputy commissioners. And they are able to scrutinize everything that is done, for example, in the interception of communications, whether they are telephonic communications or on the internet. We have an independent biometrics commissioner. And there's an elaborate mechanics for all this, because in some cases, a so-called special advocate, an independent advocate, usually a very senior independent British lawyer, can be appointed to a case. The counter-terrorism scene in the United Kingdom is complicated and quite difficult to understand, and in my view needs to be codified. That would be a useful move, and I would recommend any country to put all its law on this particular subject in one place, so that police officers, professional lawyers, and others can see it readily. But I do want to emphasize that I think we have to be realistic about this. The threats to the United Kingdom from Daesh and the other organizations I've mentioned, now from extremist right-wing terrorism, are great. And therefore we have to be realistic about how much can be exposed to the public. We need to rely on the independent mechanisms, in my view, to provide assurance to the public with the clear understanding that not everybody is going to be reassured.
Thank you very much indeed, Lord Carlisle. One of the documents that Edward Snowden, I know you're not a fan of his, but one of the documents that Edward Snowden passed to the Guardian newspaper involved a PowerPoint presentation given by GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, to analysts from the US National Security Agency who were coming to work in Britain. We have a light oversight regime compared with the US, it said, and we're less constrained by NSA's concerns about compliance. It then pointed out in the PowerPoint that Britain had an investigatory powers tribunal, which you alluded to, which assessed complaints about the security services, but so far it's added, it's always found in our favor. Should that inspire confidence?
Well, I think that the reports that have been produced by that commission have been reassuring. They have criticized. There are things that go on, for example, between the independent reviewer and the security services that ensure that where it is perceived that something is being done inappropriately, it can be corrected. I believe that certainly in the United Kingdom, I can't speak for any other country, though we have at the moment a chaotic and quite vitriolic politics, nevertheless there is a proper and reasonable degree of trust between politician and citizen, and between citizen, politician, and the security services. And I think there's a danger of being paranoid. As to Edward Snowden, I do not complain for one moment about Edward Snowden disclosing some issues of principle. But my view is the way he did it was outrageous, and I'll give you an example. One of the results of Edward Snowden's activity, and this has been carefully collated by an organization called CEOPS, which is part of the UK National Crime Agency dealing with paedophile activity around the world, is that quite a number of paedophiles had exposed to them by Snowden's revelations what was known about them. And that may have caused young kids to face even more paedophile activity around the world. And I also criticized the Guardian newspaper because in my view they published far more than they needed to do. So if he did a public service, the public service was not publishing all those emails. They didn't take the trouble, in my view, to categorize them and deal with issues of principle without simply opening the stable door.
But they did show them to the owners and ask them before they published whether they had anything to say before publication, or whether they had a reasonable challenge that would prevent publication.
Yeah, but that begs the question, Tim. You were a very distinguished BBC correspondent in Eastern Europe during the Cold War.
I was never accused of
and
that.
And I'm guessing that you may have known a few things that you never commented upon in your otherwise excellent reports, which many of us hung on when they came from particularly Poland. Because we all know that there are things that need to be protected. That's why we have something called national security. What we're talking about here is not about that principle, but about whether we're getting the mechanisms right. There's always room for improvement, of course. But by and large, I don't think there's very much cause for complaint about the way we do it. Indeed, only the UK and Australia now have an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. And a lot of countries from around the world have been coming and asking us to help them to consider establishing similar organizations and also a similar counter-terrorism policy to our own.
Those who are involved in oversight are essentially presented with a darkened room, aren't they? How do you know what to ask for? The simple answer is you don't, do you? You get what they offer you.
Well, I mean, obviously, you're right to infer that the people who do the oversight are as good as they are and no better. You've got to know what to ask. I think the advantage of having had, as independent reviewer of terrorism legislation, going right back to the Northern Ireland troubles, consistently somebody who had been a succession of people who had been real trial lawyers, who had cross-examined for a living, means that on the whole they've been pretty good at knowing what questions to ask and asking the questions. And from my period, and certainly from David Anderson, who succeeded me, from David Anderson's period, I don't believe either of us has ever been criticized for failing to ask the right questions. Of course we've been criticized for giving the wrong answers, but that's a risk you take when you do a job like that, and indeed answering those criticisms is one of the pleasures of having as public a position as that.
You've said some years ago that while you were carrying out your oversight functions, you saw no evidence of a malevolent government in Britain and that the security services were honourable. I suppose my question to you is, are you satisfied that if they were to stray from that honourable path, God forbid, such oversight as there is robust enough to catch that?
Well, if I was able to, which I'm not, I would give you some examples, particularly relating to Northern Ireland, in which the review process was able to secure better compliance with improving civil liberties concepts. But I think the system, if you do have the kind of mechanics we have, which includes the continuing right for jury trial, we don't have executive witness detention as occurs in some countries. We don't have just a splendid black letter system, like, say, Bangladesh does, but just arrest and kill people because we think they're terrorists, as Bangladesh does. And we actually have the rule of law. I think the key to all this is one has to be absolutely robust and determined about the rule of law, and one has to respect the very strong, and it's much stronger than in America, by the way, in the United States. We have to respect the very strong civil liberties NGOs that keep us on our toes, and there are lots of them, aren't there?
And the European Court of Human Rights, which also keeps you on your toes.
Well, the European Court of Human Rights serves a useful purpose, though I'm not sure that it serves a very useful purpose for the United Kingdom. The European Court of Human Rights probably doesn't achieve more than the UK courts do. We now have a Supreme Court which replaced the old Supreme Court equivalent, which was the House of Lords. It was a slightly historical and theoretical construct. And I think actually UK judicial review justice, which I referred to right at the beginning of my remarks, remains a pretty good example for worldwide digestion. But the European Court of Human Rights is particularly important at the moment because there are a number of countries in Europe, 3 of them in the European Union, which are not truly compliant with the rule of law. One about which you are a real expert, much more expert than me, which is Poland, and also Hungary and Romania, where the political parties seem to be competing not to produce better and better policies, but to out-corrupt each other.
All right, Lord Carlisle, thank you very much indeed. Let me turn now to Mary Beth Goodman. She's served as Special Assistant to President Obama and Senior Director for Development and Democracy on the National Security Council. She's also worked for the Departments of State and Homeland Security and is now with the New America Foundation. Mary Beth.
Thank you. As you heard, I'm active in civil society now, but I did have the pleasure of working in the Obama White House on the National Security Council for 5 years. And prior to that, served as a diplomat at the U.S. Department of State. And I had a very unique position at the NSC. And I led a team that worked to promote democracy, development, and to coordinate all of our humanitarian affairs. At least in the Obama White House, defense and diplomacy and development were recognized as a mutually reinforcing and complementary approach to how we did our national security. And throughout all of our work, development was a core pillar of American power. Development experts sat alongside all of our generals in the White House Situation Room when we were talking about critical national security issues. And that might seem a little bit odd to some of you, but as we've had Admiral Mike Mullen and General David Petraeus and many of our military leaders say numerous times, our national experience after 15 years of war in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East and now some parts of Africa have shown us clearly that diplomacy and development assistance are absolutely critical to our national security. Our common global security and our national security are advanced by the development of stable nations that are making progress on social development, on economic growth, and good governance. By countries that are enforcing the rule of law and investing in the health and the education of their own people. In short, it's all of our common interests that are served by nations that give their people hope for a more prosperous and safe future. But now we have this issue of trust, rather the lack of trust, right, for governments around the globe. Part of that mistrust comes from being overly secretive and mishandling citizens' privacy. There are circumstances in which governments can legitimately restrict openness in the name of national security, but in this modern connected era, the trend is towards openness, and citizens are demanding nothing less. That is part of the premise of what OGP was founded on. Open governments recognize that true democracy involves working with citizens and stakeholders, not just getting elected and claiming to work for them. Open governments acknowledge and benefit from the input, the knowledge, and the expertise that citizens can contribute to the operations and the decision-making of government. Open government is about far more than just putting laws and policies up on a website. It requires a fundamental change in how governments go about doing the very business of governing. It is about using innovative activities, approaches, and strategies to better connect citizens and stakeholders to their governments. One of the most important assets that any government has are the government data sets. Data is a valuable national resource and a strategic asset to any government, its partners, and to the public. Managing this data as an asset and making it available, discoverable, and usable, in other words, open, not only strengthens our democracies and promotes efficiency and effectiveness in government, but it also has the potential to create economic opportunity and improve citizens' quality of life and to fight corruption as more transparency and accountability are utilized. There are three common problems, in my opinion, that arise when governments invoke national security concerns to restrict transparency and open data. The first is a tendency to guard national security as an absolute trump over the right to information. The second is a failure to recognize how often security can actually be improved through openness. And the third is a tendency to undercut transparency during states of emergency, at precisely the moment when it serves its most important role as a safeguard of basic rights. There's always a debate, and I agree with my colleague here, about how we go about ensuring that limit of accountability, how we go about determining where the line is. And we're going to continue having that debate. That's part of what we can do through OGP. One of the first things that President Obama did when he came into office was to sign an executive order to declare that information is a valuable national asset whose value is multiplied when it is made easily accessible to the public. The executive order required that going forward, data generated by the government will be made openly available in machine-readable formats, while appropriately safeguarding the privacy, confidentiality, and security. The move made troves of previously inaccessible or unmanageable data easily accessible to entrepreneurs, researchers, and others who can use those files to generate new products and services, build businesses, and create jobs. This also included the intelligence community. And in the third U.S. National Action Plan, Alex and I actually worked closely together with other colleagues to put numerous commitments that were related to the policies on the release or declassification of our national security information and data. Ironically, some of this work is still continuing, and the Trump administration has just continued to move forward with open government, and they have released the fourth U.S. National Action Plan to continue their progress in OGP. As part of this work, in 2019, President Trump signed a law for the Open Government Data Act, which requires that all non-sensitive government data will be made available in an open and machine-readable format by default. So he's taken President Obama's executive order one step further. This law's mission is to improve the operational efficiencies and government services to reduce cost, increase public access to government information, and to spur further innovation and entrepreneurship. Security is essential to the continuance of a vibrant liberal democracy. It is critically important interest, which often justifies firm limits on the public disclosure of information held by government. But we cannot assume that national security is a trump card. An informed public can help policymakers formulate better policy, monitor the readiness of national security bureaucracies, and act independently to preserve security. An information-rich environment is one in which citizens and frontline government employees are better able to make sense of unfolding events and to respond appropriately to them. Of course, access to information helps citizens ensure that governmental powers are not misused, particularly during times of emergencies. But transparency is not simply a tool for checking government power. Often it is a tool for amplifying the capacity of the community to preserve the order upon which our liberties depend. Working in the NSC, I had to learn a lot of jargon from our military and the intelligence community. And one of those pieces of jargon that I think is most relevant here is force multiplier. A policy of transparency can be a powerful force multiplier when it helps to build a state that is resilient as well as respectful of citizens' rights. And many of you were here when Prime Minister Trudeau came and spoke to us the other day. And I'll just remind you of something that Prime Minister Trudeau said. He said, for the citizens to trust government, government needs to show that they trust their citizens with information. And I think that is something that also applies in this debate as well. Thank you.
Mary Beth Goodman, but it's not a equal relationship, is it? We have inalienable rights as citizens. The government has the rights that we choose to give them. It's different setup, isn't it?
That's absolutely right. But there have to be checks and balances with any power that is given to government by the citizens. And the same is true of national security. There's always going to be information that governments need and must withhold in order to protect citizens.
But who's the boss?
Well, that's part of the checks and balances. There is no one boss, right? In the US system, as Alex mentioned previously, we have checks and balances through our congressional committee oversight and through internal oversights that are structured within the intelligence community itself.
Can I take you back to Obama's declaration, which you mentioned, and you served in the Obama administration. Despite his willingness, apparent willingness to open up public records to a degree that we hadn't seen before, according to the New York Times, the Obama administration posted the worst record in history for fulfilling requests for public records under the Freedom of Information Act. Why was that?
I don't know if I would believe that is true. I don't know the statistics off the top of my head for our FOIA request. I do know that part of our commitments under, I think, every single one of the 3 national action plans that we did through OGP included commitments on FOIA reform. And we made a huge effort that is still ongoing to modernize our FOIA effort such that it was truly being put into the modern era by having everything be computerized and accessible so that we were coordinating in a different way across all of our agencies. And so if there was a bit of a delay, that may have been while that transition was occurring, and we reduced the number overall by the end of the administration.
At the same time, despite campaigning on a promise to protect government whistleblowers, the Obama administration made greater use of the Espionage Act to prosecute leakers and threaten journalists than all the other presidents combined. Again, that didn't really live up to the public commitment, did it?
I think there were some extraordinary episodes that occurred under that time period that you're referring to with some of the whistleblowers as well. But yes, I mean, there is always going to be an exception with some of the extreme measures that we had that occurred during the Obama administration. So yes, there were some whistleblowers that were prosecuted.
As the internal and external threats to our societies multiply, this battle to maintain a degree of government openness seems to depend on, to a large extent, on which administration is in power.
This is a difficulty many countries are facing now on OGP, as we've seen the transition from one administration to another, and certainly no different in the United States. There have been some of the initiatives that we launched that have not carried forward into the Trump administration, but ironically, many others have. And we've had several discussions over the course of the last couple of days about how you manage the transitions and continue some of the openness and some of the anti-corruption initiatives, and how you are able to continue this work. And it is difficult, and we've seen some backsliding in some of our OGP countries as they have had difficult transitions. And I know a lot of the civil society activists have had their lives threatened. They've had to really struggle with how to do some of this work in very difficult environments. Part of what this OGP community is trying to do is to create some resources and some support mechanisms to help weather the storm, if you will, in some of those difficult transitioning countries. But the one thing that OGP is trying to do is to create some continuity of effort so that the champions within government, those civil servants who stay and continue to do the work, have the support they need, and the civil society activists who are on the ground will also have the support to continue to do some of the reform efforts.
All right, Mary Beth Goodman, thank you very much indeed. Our next speaker is Tufail Chowdhury. He's a senior research fellow at Rights Watch UK. He's assistant professor of human rights at Durham University and a member of the British Foreign Office's External Review Panel. I think I'm right in saying that's very good to have you here, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to be on this panel. So Rights Watch UK as an organization has spent over 30 years working in the field of accountability and national security. It's an organization that seeks to ensure that governments are accountable for their actions in the context of national security, in particular in the UK. Its origins are as British Irish Rights Watch. And so this discussion is very pertinent to the work that we do. And what I wanted to do in the next few minutes was just to highlight some of the challenges there are to ensuring greater accountability and the importance of greater access to information for that accountability through two examples of cases where Rights Watch UK has been working, one which we've been working on for over 30 years and one more recently. I think both of them show both how, as an organization and as civil society, it's difficult to hold government to account without knowing what it is that government has done. You need to know what they have done in order to hold them to account, but recognizing at the same time that there are limits to what can be disclosed by government in the national security space, but ensuring that there is a fair, robust, and independent process for making those judgments as to what can be disclosed and what can't be disclosed. So the first example takes us back to Northern Ireland. It takes us to Belfast in 1989 and to a kitchen in North Belfast where a human rights lawyer, Pat Finucane, is having dinner with his 3 children and his wife. 2 men come into the house with sledgehammers. They shoot Pat Finucane twice. He lies on the floor. His children are under the table. They then fire 12 more shots at close range into his face, killing Pat Finucane. Pat Finucane was a lawyer who worked on national security cases. He was a lawyer whose clients were often terrorists or those who had been alleged to be terrorists. What was shocking about his case and the subsequent revelations, one that Rights Watch UK has worked on for over 2 decades, wasn't just the nature of the killing, it was the state collusion in the killing. And so after the killing, there have been subsequent investigations. The initial police investigation failed to find anybody who was responsible. There was then an investigation by Lord Sir John Stevens, and that investigation, or three subsequent investigations, led to the conclusion that there was sufficient evidence of collusion in relationship to Pat Finucane's murder. There was then an agreement by the British and Irish governments to set up an independent review of the murder, and this was undertaken by the retired Canadian Supreme Court Judge, Peter Corrie, and he also concluded that there was sufficient evidence of state collusion that required a full public independent inquiry. However, while the British government had committed to a full public inquiry in asking Peter Corrie to undertake his investigation, they then reneged on that promise. They had a more limited review of the Finucane murder, but even that review was shocking in the conclusions that it reached. Just to give you a flavor of some of the conclusions from the De Silva review, it said that the Pat Finucane case has left me in no doubt that agents of the state were involved in carrying out serious violations of human rights up to and including murder. That the RUC and the Army provided assistance to loyalist paramilitaries in instances where they shared common desires to see Republican paramilitaries killed, and that this was widespread. That 85% of the UDA's intelligence originated from sources within the security services. The UDA was heavily reliant on the flow of security forces leaks to enable them to identify Republican targets. Only this year, the family of Pat Finucane have sought judicial review of the failure to provide a full investigation into his death. The Supreme Court has rejected this on judicial review, but has accepted that the investigations that have taken place so far have not met the requirements of the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 2, the right to life. That is, they haven't provided a full and independent inquiry into the death that's taken place. Rights Watch UK has continued to work on this case. In particular, we've sought to have disclosure of the Stevens 3 report that was published back in 2003, to have a full disclosure. So far, we've only had a redacted version, a summary, but not the full disclosure. And that failure to provide a full disclosure of the inquiry, to let the family know exactly what had happened, shows or underlines the need for greater transparency, for greater openness, and greater honesty about the events that took place. So that was the first case. The second example is more recent. So Rights Watch UK was involved in a case relating to the British government's policy change that allowed it to carry out its first drone strikes against British citizens overseas. These drone strikes were carried out against 2 British citizens, and in announcing the drone strike, the government, in its parliamentary statements, noted that they had legal advice that showed that these drone strikes were lawful. So Rights Watch UK began a legal challenge to seek disclosure of the legal advice. At the time, the government sought to argue that this was excluded from freedom of information legislation because this was material that was related to the security services. The freedom of information legislation provides a class exemption for materials related to the security services. And they said that this material, because it had come within the exchanges with the security services, fell within that class of exclusion, so no public interest test could actually be applied in that case. However, our judicial review, the courts agreed with us that it was possible to have far greater disaggregation of the information. In other words, a blanket exclusion of all materials that the government had been arguing for, the wider argument for the wider interpretation of the class exclusion wasn't justified, that there needed to be a narrow interpretation of the class exclusion, and that just because material had been sent to the security services didn't mean it automatically fell within the class exclusion. And therefore, the legal advice fell outside the class exclusion. It was therefore open to having far greater, having the opportunity to see whether disclosure was in the public interest. So we won on the first point, that the legal advice wasn't part of the blanket exclusion. On the second point about whether there was a public interest on the disclosure of the legal advice, however, the court held that on balance, the public interest wasn't in the disclosure of the legal advice. So at least it was engaging in a test to examine whether there was a public interest in the disclosure, and whether that public interest could therefore be outweighed by the interest of the state in secrecy. And in reaching its decision, the court relied upon the fact that both the ISC and the Joint Human Rights Committee had already had access to the legal information and the legal advice. However, the Joint Human Rights Committee and the Intelligence Service Committee, both of which instigated inquiries in the wake of the strike, expressed serious concerns about the government's failure to be transparent during the course of their inquiries. The JCHR said that they were disappointed by the government's unhelpfulness and refusing to provide them with a detailed memorandum on their legal position. The JCHR chair, Harriet Harman, MP, noted that since the inquiry concerned a matter of utmost seriousness, to fail to be accountable to Parliament is inexcusable. The ISC chair, Dominic Grieve MP, urged the government to be more transparent, given that they have been given the full, Dominic Grieve urged the government to be more transparent, given that they have indeed been given the full facts surrounding the authorization process for the lethal strikes against British citizens. So while the government relied upon the ISC inquiry and the JCHR inquiry, both of those committees had expressed their own reservations as to whether they were given the full facts or the full transparency of the information that they needed. So I think it still leaves open the question as to how we ensure that we do have a proper, independent, robust process for ensuring that we are able to hold government to account. The Investigatory Powers Tribunal you mentioned as well. One of the difficulties that we have, and I agree with Lord Carlisle about the importance of judicial review, is that the government with the IPT is seeking to ouster the courts from being able to subject decisions of the IPT to judicial review. And that's quite important, that independent, robust judicial review is one of the key mechanisms by which civil society is able to challenge government policy, to challenge government action, and to seek greater access to information, to documents where it's appropriate. And the judiciary provide that independent oversight. And so attempts by government to ouster the jurisdictions of the judiciary, I think for us, are very alarming. Most recently, Privacy International has been successful in a case where the Supreme Court in England, in the UK, has said that the attempt to ouster the jurisdiction of the High Court when it came to the IPT wasn't entirely successful, that it couldn't oust their jurisdiction when it came to the interpretation of the legislation.
Thank you very much indeed. Very briefly, were you comforted or concerned by what you heard from the other panelists about efforts to improve transparency and oversight both in America and in Britain?
I think efforts to improve oversight are important. I think the challenge is ensuring that those efforts lead to robust standards being applied, and to ensuring that those who are applying those standards have sufficient independence from the state to be able, from the executive, to be able to hold the executive to account. In the case involving the drone strikes, one of the harshest criticisms that came from the upper tribunal in its decision was against the Freedom of Information Commissioner. The Freedom of Information Commissioner, who made the initial decision not to disclose or to accept the class exclusion of legal advice, had accepted, rubber-stamped the advice that they had received from the government. And from our view, that's allowing the government to be the judge in its own case. And the tribunal is very clear that it wasn't sufficient to just say, well, we'll accept the advice from the government that this is excluded under the FOI Act. The commissioner should herself have looked at the material to decide whether it should be excluded. So I think there are definitely ways in which transparency can be, and accountability can be more robust and can be improved.
Alex Joel, you were making copious notes there. Did you have anything you wanted to add on that?
I was just making notes on what the other folks have been saying as well. I guess
transparent notes.
Transparent, yeah. I guess would be film or something here. I did have some reactions to a couple of the comments that were going back and forth. So you had asked about oversight and about how somebody in a position of oversight knows whether or not they have seen what they need to see. So this is a common challenge across anybody who's conducting oversight, and there is no magic bullet answer. So an oversight body can request briefings and can request information on broad topic areas. You can certainly understand what the laws and protections are and then ask how those are being implemented. So there are various mechanisms by which you can request information. I think independence is important as a component of the framework for oversight. I do think you need to have internal champions for oversight. I do think that people like positions like the one I occupy can serve a very useful role, because I and my counterparts at other intelligence community elements, we're right in the thick of things. We see what's going on. We have relationships with all the leaders. We have relationships all the way up and down the chain. We have complaint mechanisms where people can bring information to us in a formal way, but those are not frequently used. Much more frequently are the informal pointers that we get. You know, people saying, "Alex, have you looked into this program? I want to make sure you're aware of it." And so then we'll do it, keeping the identity of the person who provided that information to us confidential, and look into it. And obviously we have a strong commitment to providing oversight, to supporting the oversight of entities like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. Another thing to keep in mind from an oversight perspective is in our system, Congress has the power of the purse. So they get very detailed information about what the intelligence agencies are spending money on and requesting money to be spent on. So they have the ability to see everything that the intelligence agencies are doing that costs money, which is everything we do. So, so that's pretty granular from an oversight perspective.
Okay. In the time we have left, we'll take some questions. There are microphones available. If you have a question, please, let's hear from you.
Hi, I have a question. So I'm not sure how to really phrase this, but I think at one point in our post-Snowden world, when governments talk to the big providers of IT, the conversation was really about the telcos, whether it's Orange or whether it's TELUS or whether it's Verizon, and about the metadata that the government was collecting from individual transactions. The conversation, particularly this week, has shifted to the Facebooks and the Twitters. But I wonder from a national security perspective, whether it's still, from a transparency perspective, interesting to have that more systemic transparency around what the government is doing in regards to its citizens. as opposed to what you've talked about, mostly except for Mary Beth, is event-specific transparency. I wonder if you could address that.
Lord Carlisle, want to have a go at that?
Well, I'm not sure I heard the whole question, but I think the government has an important role to ensure that it keeps its citizens safe. Indeed, there are those who say it's the first role of government to keep its citizens safe. And in order to do so, it has to find stuff out. There was a case decided yesterday in the United Kingdom, in the England and Wales Court of Appeal, where the court held that it's legitimate for the authorities to find out what they can about somebody who is regarded on a reasonably sound basis as Islamist radical who is opposed to United Kingdom law on counter-terrorism issues. I think the most important issue arising from what you said, and I said I didn't hear your question fully, is that the internet providers and other big electronics companies do actually have a duty not only to police themselves properly, but to provide information when it's legitimately needed for the maintenance of law and order. But I prefer that to be done myself by voluntary arrangements, because the moment they refuse to do voluntary arrangements and we do it for them, then we're stuck with laws which are very restrictive and very inflexible.
But we praise them if they resist such requests from, say, the Chinese government or the Russian government. We're not very consistent about this, and
Well, I mean, if you look at the Brexit referendum in 2016, which changed British politics possibly forever, and certainly, in my view, much for the worse, there was an awful lot. There's plenty of evidence now of Russian interference in what happened in that referendum, as there is in the last United States presidential election, without question. And,
but these companies should stand up to requests from repressive governments.
These companies have to be accountable. But I prefer the idea of international agreements which make them accountable than clumsy and difficult to change national laws that will not allow evolution of the issue.
Can I? Yeah, sure. Just also to address I think part of the question. So the transparency that we're talking about, I mean, the conversation here was around the call detail record program under the USA Freedom Act, but it's a lot broader than that. We try to lean very forward in terms of how we provide transparency in our procedures and our guidelines and things of that nature. The annual statistical transparency report, which you can find on IC on the Record, contains statistics on the use of all the key national security authorities that are in statute inside the United States that go beyond just the metadata program. And I'll say more broadly in terms of the private sector or on this issue generally, there's a difference between what any one of us may have in our mind when we think of this topic and try to think, oh, what do I remember focusing on versus what's actually out there in public, as we all know. So you may not feel, oh, I don't really know this. And that may be because we haven't disclosed much about it, or it may be because we have disclosed it and people haven't really focused on it, and it's not top of their mind. So that's one of the lessons we've learned in transparency. There's a big difference between putting something out and then people actually reading it. So that second part, people actually reading it, is something that comes when experts engage in it, when there's a discussion about it, when the topic becomes more pertinent to something that's relevant to somebody's life. The fact of putting a report out does nothing other than have a PDF file up there on the website.
Anybody else have a question, please? Yep.
For Alex, Joel, and Lord Carlisle primarily, could you speak to the inherent tensions and difficulties between your roles as enhancing oversight and transparency in the security services and intelligence community, and the natural tendency in those organizations to keep information secret, and how do you manage those difficulties and challenges?
Look, Carlisle.
That's a very good question, and I think I can answer it fairly directly. I can only do it by example. I can't go into the specifics of a case. But I was asked, in fact, by the government to carry out an inquiry because there were some allegations relating to something that the intelligence services had done in Northern Ireland. I went to the intelligence service in question and I said, I want to see everything, right down to the post-it notes. They said, we've never done anything like that before. I said, right, do you want me to write an open letter to the minister published in the newspapers saying that you refused to let me see all your information? The following day, I saw all the information, literally right down to the post-it notes. And provided that the person who's doing the job is experienced in the examination and analysis of evidence, then as long as they appoint the right people to do these kinds of jobs, and obviously there are imponderables like that, I think that it is reasonably likely that proper scrutiny will be carried out. To take another example, the Intelligence and Security Committee of parliamentarians that I mentioned earlier, which is chaired by a very distinguished lawyer, a Conservative member of Parliament called Dominic Grieve, has been very assiduous in extracting everything it needs to see. And the practice has changed. I was actually a member of the House of Commons on the day when Margaret Thatcher, as Prime Minister, for the first time in public, said that there was something called MI5. We all knew it, but it could never be said in Parliament. These days, the leaders of MI5, and very particularly the current leader of MI6, make public speeches in which they use hypotheticals to justify the work that they've been doing and explain it to a much wider public. And I think that's a good improvement.
Alex Joel, do you get tough with the intelligence agencies, threaten to go public if they don't give you what you want?
No, I do not. I get tough, but I don't threaten to go public if they don't give me what I want.
Would you keep your job if you did?
Well, you have to release information through authorized channels. So as I said, as a chief transparency officer for the DNI, I am one of the firmest believers in going through authorized channels to make sure that we're releasing information properly. Otherwise, if you put sources and methods at risk through transparency efforts, you really put at risk the whole transparency process that we've been building. Transparency has to be viewed as part of the core mission of the intelligence agencies. You have to find a way for it to be consistent with people's commitment to national security. And so the way that, just to get to the question, I would distinguish that into two different forms. One is oversight. So what do you do with oversight? I have found that and this is perfectly illustrated by your answer, Lord Carlisle, the surest way to get an oversight entity upset with you and focused on perhaps putting your authorities at risk is to withhold information from the oversight entity. Nothing gets the attention of an oversight entity faster and with greater intensity than their perception that you are holding information back from them. So that is not something I ever want our agencies to be doing. Secondly, in terms of the public, one of the things that we are that we stress, and I think we've internalized in the intelligence community, is that we want our efforts to be sustainable. To be sustainable, you have to be confident that what you are doing is the right thing and you're doing it in the right way and that you're proud of it. And that should it ever come public, you will be proud of what you are doing and how you have done it. And in order for Congress to be able to continue to fund your activity and to continue to authorize the activity, you must have a plan in place or an approach in place to think about how am I going to explain this program to, of course, to Congress in a classified setting, but give them the information they need to be able to go public with why they're supporting a particular activity or a particular legislation that you think is important for the agency. So I think public sustainability is built on public trust. Trust is also important with foreign partners who are themselves subject to scrutiny for dealing with intelligence services inside the United States or for private sector folks as well. So in order for all of those people to have trust in you, you have to be more transparent than perhaps you might otherwise have felt inclined to be.
Tufal Chowdhury, you wanted to say something here.
Yeah, I think for us, one of the most important things is not only to ensure that you have robust, strong, and independent oversight, but that the process for appointing people to those oversight bodies is one that itself is transparent and open. And I think Lord Carlisle's successor, David Anderson, insisted that the process for appointing the independent reviewer is now one that takes place through the Public Appointments Commission process, so that there is a clear job description, there are opportunities for people to apply, that there is a criteria by which applicants are assessed. At this moment in the UK, the government is in the process of appointing a reviewer, an independent reviewer for our CVE program, Prevent. And one of the key task that Rights Watch UK is campaigning on is to ensure that that appointments process is one that is open and transparent and meets the requirements of the public appointments process, that it isn't just somebody who is appointed without much greater acknowledgement and open process that takes place. And I think it's important both for the credibility of an independent review, but also for the confidence that it can instill in the important jobs that they do.
I agree with everything you've just said, though I have to say, and this is a British domestic thing, I think the appointment of a Prevent reviewer was completely unnecessary, based on fictitious or a complete lack of evidence, and only agreed to because the government doesn't have a majority in the House of Commons.
All right, on that note, we won't go into what Prevent actually is. I'm sure most people here know about it. All right, that's for another session. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry? I think we have another question. You have another question. All right, another brief question. Yes.
It's a TTK from Taiwan. So speaking of the China influence Taiwan, we are at a front line. So I would like to ask, if you may answer, whether or not you see there's evidence that authoritarian countries, or in your country, using like using open data portal or open government to collect data more efficiently from other country. Do you see that? If yes, how we argue pushing our government to do more open, why there is a threat or there's a potential that China or other government can know us better or weaponize our
benefit
democracy.
from open government in the West, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mary Beth Goodman.
Yeah, thanks for giving me an easy question at the end. There's always the trade-off of the more you're putting online in an open way and being as transparent as possible, that people are going to take that information and weaponize it against you, right? I mean, we have that debate in the United States all the time because some people in our own country think that we are overly transparent with our congressional testimonies and just everything that we have put online. And groups that want to do us harm use it against us. I think there's a trade-off there, and that is an ongoing debate. But that is a different type of information, perhaps, than what you need to protect for national security reasons. What we are talking about is, as Alex said, the sources and methods and all of the things that need to be protected, because a government's primary job is to protect its citizens, right? And what we're trying to prevent with an open government and open data policy is that reflexive habit that many governments have had for decades, and some of them for centuries, to just simply classify everything. It's just a reflexive habit to keep everything in secrecy from its citizens. And that time period is a bygone era. That is over. We have so moved on, and citizens are demanding more information that it is actually the citizens' information, and they want it from their governments. They want to have the access to this. And that period of just holding on to it is gone. And so there's a difference between having the transparency with everything online that citizens can use and it being open for everyone to see, and what needs to be held back for national security reasons to protect the citizens and to have a safety and a national security actual reason to hold it back.
All right, and now we really have run out of time. Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists. Thank you to the audience for coming. I hope you got a lot out of it. We covered a lot of ground. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.